Right, here we go, the full review of the BSA Gold Star 650. Or is it 650 Gold Star? That always confuses me and I've got no idea why. Now, the historical records show that I got it completely wrong about this bike. I didn't like it when it was first announced. I think I sort of wanted to like it, but I just didn't. I didn't like the idea that it was a pretty modern looking water-cooled engine. I didn't like the idea that it was a single, although obviously if it was a Gold Star it had to be a single. And I wasn't overly impressed by the pre-production models that they had on show at the NEC in 2022. And yes, I admit it, I developed a jaundiced attitude towards this motorcycle, as someone so eloquently put it in the comments section of my last video. But as I've said so many times in the past, well, at least twice, if I get something wrong, I'll put my hand up to it and I'll put the record straight. And you've got no idea how difficult it is for a Yorkshireman to do that. Now, in the comments over the last two videos, I've noticed quite a bit of, shall we call it, prejudice towards this bike. And I think one thing that worries me is that, you know, it's that concern that I may be partly responsible for that. Now, don't get me wrong, this motorcycle isn't perfect. No motorcycle is. But one thing that I've become certain of over the last sort of 2 weeks of riding this motorcycle is that the pros far outweigh the cons. First of all, let's set a few things straight that sort of came from that very first walk around that I did over a week ago now. I've had a lot of accusations that I've been nobbled by BSA, that they're paying me to make these videos. The only offer that I've had from BSA was the offer to borrow a bike for a couple of weeks. And that's where my relationship with BSA starts and ends. I'm perfectly capable of liking and enjoying more than one brand at the same time. I haven't defected from Royal Enfield. I was never part of Royal Enfield. This is just my honest opinion of a product, like a lot of other products that I've reviewed over the years. Now, first of all, I just want to revisit the frame on this motorcycle. Some of the character assassination comments, if you like, that I got for this bike in the comments section related to this triangular subframe which supports, or partly supports the seat, but more importantly supports the top of the shock absorber. The whole weight of the bike is on this, and the whole weight of the rider and the pillion, and the main sort of complaint was that BSA don't know how to make a motorcycle because they've had to sort of weld together 4 pieces of tubing to make this shape. I thought I made it quite clear in, you know, that video on how this was constructed. Now, I don't know whether I'm going to be using the right terminology here, but bear with me. If you look at where the loop is actually welded onto the main part of the frame, this looks to me like a butt weld, in that the two parts have simply been butted together and then welded. There's a distinct weld fillet. But if you look here and here, they're a different type of weld. They'll look like socket welds. Now, I can't be 100% certain without dismantling the bike, removing all the paint from the frame, and then dismantling the welds. But you look at where the shock hanger actually attaches to the frame, there's no visible signs of a weld. It's a smooth transition between the two. Now, there are certain other little telltale signs in this assembly which lead me to believe that this is either a forged or a cast part. And this is what I meant when I said that this bike is over-engineered. Most manufacturers would have just welded that lug onto the top of that loop, which always leaves an inherently weak connection on the frame. BSA have gone the extra mile. Most of the connections on this frame are socketed welds with just a handful of fillet sort of butt welds to connect other parts together. This frame is over-engineered. This is not a sign of cheap construction or not knowing what you're doing. This is a sign of a company that is taking care to make sure that their frame construction is better than the competition's. And I think that what really surprises me is that no other reviewer has picked up on this. Now, the other thing that I wanted to draw attention to is the switchgear. This is moulded plastic switchgear. The same sort of construction that you will see on probably 80% of the motorcycles on the road. Now, while I was demonstrating this switchgear, it moved slightly. That's perfectly normal because of the way these are fastened onto motorcycles. And when it happened, I thought, should I explain that to the viewers? And then I thought, no, because that's just insulting their intelligence. Because, any experienced, self-respecting motorcyclist should know how these components are attached to the motorcycle. They don't clamp on. One half, or sometimes both halves, will have a locator pin in them, which fits into a hole that's drilled in the handlebar. So when both halves of the assembly are fastened together, those locator pins hold them in place. And there's always a little bit of play in them. There has to be, for various reasons. It's not a sign that it's loose and is of substandard construction or in any way faulty. That is how they are designed to be. They are all like that. They will move so far in either direction then they stop dead. Right, so there were some early concerns over paint quality on these motorcycles. I think these were teething troubles. They appeared when the model was newly released, and I think it was down to the fact that these tanks are chromed before painting, which means the areas that then need to be painted have to be keyed in order to accept the paint and for the paint to stick to it properly, because chrome is very resilient stuff. It won't allow anything to stick to it. Now, there were certainly no issues on the test bike that I was given. I've done a bit of research on it. It seemed to be just a few early models that were affected, and that problem has now been sorted out. There were also one or two issues with the engines stalling, and I think there was some problems with the engine light not going out. These are all now being rectified, as far as I'm aware, and they are not ongoing problems on the current models that are being sold. What is something of an issue, and I completely understand this, is the lack of a centre stand. Now, I've had a good look under this bike. I can't see any way that a centre stand could possibly work with this design, and the main reason for it is BSA have elected to put all the emissions control systems underneath the bike in such a way that it deletes the opportunity to have a centre stand. I'm not going to lie, this is a minus on this bike. A centre stand, the ability to get the back wheel up off the ground, is essential for routine chain maintenance, and there aren't even any welded M8 lugs to accept bobbins to use a conventional paddock stand, which I would have liked to have seen at the very least. This is an issue, but it's not an issue that can't be overcome. It'll be interesting to see whether BSA going forward does anything about this in order to make the bike more appealing to owners. As I say, even for me, it's not ideal, but it doesn't put me off the bike because, I'm quite conversant with using bike jacks. It's not a major problem for me, but I can see that it's going to be a non-negotiable deal breaker for some people. There are some little compensations. The steering lock works both ways, full right lock and full left lock. That's something I've not seen on a motorcycle for quite a few years. They only generally lock on left lock. And it is nice to be able to lock the bike up with the steering pointing to the right sometimes if you're short on space. Now, let's talk about handling. Again, comments have come up that there's a problem with the handling of this bike. I think this all boils down to the current mentality, which has actually been going for a couple of decades with the motorcycle press. If a bike is meant to be used on the road, it's got to handle like a sports bike. And of course that sentiment is parroted by all the cut and paste reviews that we see here on YouTube and everywhere else. Don't think for yourself, just repeat everything that MCN has said and then no one can criticise you. Now, unfortunately, most motorcycle manufacturers are very conscious of this and that those sort of comments can harm sales. so they all do the best to approximate sports bike leg handling on the machines, which for a modern classic really is a little bit silly. And BSA have taken a completely different route and moved away from the head. Now, I'll explain what I think the roots of this motorcycle are towards the end of this video, but suffice to say for the moment, the steering angle on the front forks is quite gradual, and we also have quite plush suspension with minimal damping. Well, I say minimal damping, it's still got plenty of damping, it's just not as harsh as you would expect on a lot of modern bikes, even modern classics. This translates into what I would describe as stately, classic handling characteristics. Even on these nasty sort of rural farm roads that you see me on here, pushing the bike to the maximum speed limit for this road, 60 miles an hour, taking the twists and turns, the bike's just fine. The steering rate means that it does understeer slightly. The handlebars are higher than normal and they're also pretty wide. So if you've just got off a sack of crappy Z6000 sports bike, yeah, it's gonna feel substantially different, but that doesn't mean that there's a problem with it. It means there's a problem with you as the rider, because you're unable to adapt to the motorcycle that you're riding. Now, as I explained on my last video regarding the pillion use on this motorcycle, this is an uber comfortable motorcycle. You can just eat the miles up on it, and you know, there are no aches and pains. You get off feeling refreshed at the other end. And that's what I think BSA were aiming at. They've moved away from the head and they've gone their own route. Because you see, those entertaining switchbacks, hairpin bends and twist and turns, although they are fun, they only constitute about 3% of the overall mileage that you ever cover on a bike. So, from a customer's point of view, what is the point of designing a bike that works brilliantly 3% of the time, but is a compromise that potentially tortures its rider for 97% of the time? And I know this is the case because I get all the comments about different bikes and about the owner's complaints, back problems, hip problems, knee problems, shoulder and wrist problems, all stemming from the riding position and the way the bike feels on the road, suspension, etc. Yeah, if you're riding this bike, your mates might lose you on the twist and turns on their sports bikes or their sports oriented modern classics, but you'll catch them up. You'll all arrive at your destination at the same time, and you will feel a lot better than they will when you get off the bikes. It's just common sense, really. The riding position is 100%, or should I say feels 100% natural when you're in the saddle. The handlebars are high, they're also quite wide. You're low down compared to some other modern classics. The suspension is plush. Some road imperfections, surprisingly, you don't feel at all, but those that you do, you know, you get that sensation of going over them, but it doesn't smack you in the arse like some rear shocks do. Over 400 miles on the second position on the preload. I couldn't adjust it any further because some journalist had obviously walked off with the C-spanner in his pocket. I'm sure BSA would like that back if that's you. Mostly carrying a pillion, the bike can feel a little bit lively at times, but it never gives you any cause for concern. You know, when your suspension bottoms out, you feel it, and even crashing through some very nasty potholes on our travels, this suspension never bottomed out once. So I would say, as I said in my last video, this bike is tuned for reasonable performance, but ultimately it's tuned to provide comfort to the pilot and co-pilot. Everything's there that you need. You know, you've got good feedback from the road through your front suspension and rear suspension. Nothing ever feels vague or detached. You know exactly what's going on. It's just comfortable. It has a slightly longer wheelbase than other vehicles in this class, which provides superb straight line stability at any speed. It loves carrying pillions, and pillions love being carried by it. In fact, for the most part, you don't even notice that you've got a passenger on board. I mean, I was apt to forget occasionally. The bike just doesn't seem to notice the extra weight. If I was asked to describe what other motorcycle this particular BSA feels like, I would have to say a Royal Enfield Classic 350, but with a 650 engine in it, but sort of beefed up and scaled up with a lot more power. It's a very similar, stately, relaxed riding experience. Think Rolls-Royce or Bentley Continental rather than Ferrari. It just does what it does it extremely well, and it doesn't try to pretend that it's anything else. The brakes are superb, far better than any Nissan Bibre or even other Brembos that I've used. Again, very intuitive, plenty of feel at the brake levers, really well balanced brakes that seem to react to how far you pull the lever rather than how hard you pull the lever. It just gives you instinctively whatever it is you want. Despite the wide bars, it will filter in traffic really well. I didn't actually film it because I don't filter when I'm carrying a pillion, because she doesn't like it. The bike's fine in heavy traffic and even in stop-start traffic. The low centre of gravity, the reasonably low seating position means that it's not a handful. In fact, it does it better than the Classic 350. The only negative with heavy stop-start traffic, especially in the hot weather that we've been getting, is that the electronic fan does cut on a lot and then sort of wafts hot air from the engine up into your face while you're sitting in the baking sun. It's not pleasant. Unfortunately, it's just a feature of water-cooled bikes. That might be welcome in British spring, autumn and winter though. The clutch is smooth and light, nothing particularly to shout about. It's just one of those things that you use, and if you don't notice it, it's a good clutch. It's a 5-speed gearbox and it is excellent. I didn't have any problems with this gearbox getting on for 500 miles. Very slick and precise. You maybe get a little bit more feedback when exchanging gears than you do with something like a Royal Enfield. A nice healthy click that lets you know that you've got it where it needs to be. If you have to come to an abrupt stop and crash down through your gearbox, no problems whatsoever. It never got confused or sort of, snarled up. It was just click, 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 click until I was in first. Excellent gearbox, I can't fault it. First gear is a little bit short, it sort of just gets you going, then you soon find you need to engage second. The rest of the gears are quite tall. I've heard one or two journalists describe fifth gear as nothing more than an overdrive. I disagree. If you're going at 40 miles an hour and you wind the throttle back, the bike goes like a scalded cat. That's not what overdrives do. It's a fifth gear. Now, if you're trundling along in 30 mile an hour zones with or without pillion, this bike is not happy at 30 miles an hour in top gear. You need to drop down to fourth. But again, with or without pillion, once you hit 35, it'll readily accept fifth gear and all is good from there. Where this bike really excels in my mind is A and B roads, dual carriageways and motorways. This is a great motorway bike, it loves it. The engine's smooth with a very, very slightly detectable roughness at 60 miles an hour, and obviously you can feel a little bit more vibration if you're accelerating hard as that piston tries to overcome the inertia of dragging two middle-aged people from whatever speed to a new higher speed. The strongest performance from this motorcycle is from between 40 and 80 miles an hour. That's where this engine really shines. It pulls really hard. If you wind the throttle back, it will start to propel you backwards on your seat. I've seen a dyno printout that shows that the power starts to trail off at around about 5,000 revs, but just to put that into perspective, at 70 miles an hour on the motorway, this bike is only doing 4,400 revs. So there's plenty more left in reserve if you need to overtake. I'm used to riding naked roadsters. I don't like screens. Over the years, my neck muscles have acclimatised to 70 mile an hour motorway speeds without any protection. Airflow is very clean. There's no discernible buffeting. I could quite happily sit on a motorway at 70 mile an hour for probably up to about 50 miles before I needed a comfort brake. And I noticed it was very noticeable at these speeds. The suspension front and rear is absolutely loving it. It's at its absolute best at high speeds. Seat comfort and riding position, they're just perfect for me. I mean, everybody's different anatomically. Some people might not get along with it, but I think for most average people, they're going to find it, you know, just what the doctor ordered as far as comfort's concerned. Now, fuel consumption. The bike had fuel in it when I got it, but I don't think it was full. It was just partly full. The bike does have a fuel gauge. When it got down to 1 bar, I'd only just covered 100 miles, just over 100 miles, which wasn't a good start. So I filled the tank up to just the bottom of the register plate on the filler, and it's a very easy bike to fill up, by the way. There's no obstructions that make getting fueling difficult. Some of you will know what I mean. And I was roughly 40 or 50 miles into that tank before I realised that I didn't know what the mileage was when I filled it up, and I hadn't reset either of the trip meters. So I let the bike run dry until the gauge had gone down to 1 bar, and then refilled it up to again to the, so it was just touching the register plate under the fuel filler, and it took 8.5 or 8.4 something litres, and that was last Saturday afternoon. Now by Monday afternoon I was back down to 1 bar again. Now I remember looking at it at some traffic lights that are probably just over a mile away from my home. It was on 1 bar, but the petrol light wasn't on yet. I don't know at what point the petrol light came on, but by the time I'd got parked up in my drive, it was on. I'd covered 157 miles, so I knocked a mile off because I don't know exactly when that fuel light had come on. Now, the government tests sort of advertised by BSA say that this bike does 70.6 miles to the gallon, and I suspect that is using E10 fuel, which I think they use as the industry standard now. I should point out that I was putting E5 in it. I don't put E10 in any of my vehicles, so that might have contributed to a little bit better sort of fuel mileage than their figures show. But what it doesn't take into account is that throughout that entire tank of fuel, I was carrying Paula on the back. And it was a good mix of A and B roads between sort of 40 and 60 mile an hour. A little bit of dual carriageway and motorway work at 70 miles an hour. And a fair bit of stop-start traffic at 30 mile an hour and below. Now, BSA say that the tank has a total capacity of 12 litres, but there's about 200 millilitres of dead space in there. I wasn't really sure what I was dealing with, so I went back to the garage, filled the bike up to the register plate once again, and I managed to squeeze just under 9.8 litres, which is a little over 2 gallons. And that's proper imperial gallons, by the way, not your Mickey Mouse US gallons. So I know I used 9.8 litres to travel 156 miles. I worked it out to 72.3 miles to the gallon, which I think is slightly better than what I get out of the Interceptor 650. Although most of my riding on the Interceptor has been solo work, not pillion. So the BSA Gold Star 650 is a reasonably economical bike to run. Now, servicing, I believe it's every 6,200 miles, which is a bit of an odd figure, but there you go. The chain needs to be lubed every 600 miles, which is quite generous. I think it's normally 400 to 500 miles depending on the manufacturer, although I think, if I remember rightly, the Triumph Bonnevilles are every 200 miles, but don't quote me on that, I might have remembered it wrong. An oil and filter change looks reasonably simple and straightforward. Valve clearances, though, it's a shim and bucket system. Now, I've only ever done the clearances on a shim and bucket system once in my youth, and it was a bit of a nightmare. You have to take half the engine apart, that's what it seemed like at the time. And then I couldn't get the correct size shims from the dealership, which was complicated by the fact that the bike was in pieces in my dad's drive. The good news is they don't have to be checked that often. Again, don't quote me on this because I'm going on memory. I've done so much reading on this bike and it's all sort of starting to melt my brain now. I think it's every 12,000 miles. That doesn't mean that it will need to be adjusted and new shims put in every time. It's just the intervals at which they need to be checked. And actually checking them is fairly simple and straightforward, like it is with a conventional or traditional lock nut tappet setup. I think most owners are probably going to elect to have the dealership do their valve clearances, and I don't blame them, it's alright messing about. But the strange thing is, it seems that the valve clearances need to be checked at the first service, which is unusual for a bucket and shim system. Generally speaking, they bang them in and they're good for whatever the recommended service intervals are. Perhaps BSA will amend that in time if they find that there's no need for that initial check. Only time will tell. It is what it is. But that does put this motorcycle servicing wise pretty much in line with most mainstream motorcycle manufacturers. Now, I think you've probably divined that I'm quite enthusiastic about this bike. So let's discuss that. I'll tell you why. Now, I started riding bikes in the early 1980s, and a lot of the bikes that were on sale in the early 1980s were bikes that had been designed originally back in the 1970s. I also had the pleasure of riding a lot of motorcycles that were built in the 1970s. Bikes were fun then, you know, they were fast, they handled okay, and they were comfortable. They were your mode of transport for getting everywhere, and they did it really, really well. And then in the mid-1980s, the race replica craze took off, which then transformed to be the sports bike category, and then tourers, adventure tourers came along, and you know, that basic all-rounder seemed to sort of disappear from the motorcycle dealerships. Now, you can call that progress if you like, but I think what was lost from motorcycling then was just the bare comfort necessities of travelling around on a motorcycle. That was what made it so much fun. Those bikes weren't focused on any particular discipline. They were just good quality all-round transport. And you know, I did my stint on sports bikes, half performance bikes as a young man. Then I changed to tourers, sports tourers, and then I found myself circling back to more basic bikes, because when you've got those sort of single-minded focused motorcycles, a lot of the fun goes out of motorcycling. And you know, I adopted the Triumph Bonnevilles and then went over to what I considered to be a more genuine experience in the Royal Enfields. But with bikes like the Interceptor and the Continental GT, now I can't blame Royal Enfield for this. They had to pander to customer expectations, and customer expectations are based on what the motorcycle press are telling them. And of course, the motorcycle press, as I said earlier on, if a bike is designed to be used on a road, it has to handle like a sports bike. There's no sort of negotiation with these people. So even the Interceptor still has a bias towards sort of sports bike performance, especially in the handling department, which means, you know, the suspension, etc., does give some people problems. And it seems to me that what BSA have done, they've sat down and they've said, right, we're not going to have any of that nonsense. We'll just build a bike how they used to be built, you know, when the Gold Star became famous. And if you look at the later era Gold Star motorcycles, they were no longer competitive with the stuff that the Japanese were bringing into the country, so they started to pitch them more at the touring and general purpose market. And when you look at the new Gold Star, it's got all the sort of design cues and connotations of those later models. That, I believe, is what they've based this bike on. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy all of my other motorcycles, but this last 2 weeks on the Gold Star has brought back for me the joy of, you know, sticking a Doris on the back of the bike and just going out for the day and doing whatever you want. You know, the beauty of being able to park anywhere and park for free and not have any, you know, time restrictions on when you've got to get back before you get a ticket. The versatility of a good-looking general purpose motorcycle that has the capability to do pretty much whatever you ask from it, with the minimum of fuss and fanfare. Now, it's got the looks of the old BSA Gold Star. I mean, I know the engine is a bit of departure from the original, and I've had loads of people commenting, you know, this is not a real BSA Gold Star, it's not got this, it's not got that, it should be air-cooled, it should be this, it should be that. The truth of the matter is, if BSA had built an exact replica of a 1960s BSA Gold Star, everyone would think it was wonderful, but no one would want to buy it, because the riding and ownership experience wouldn't live up to what they used to. So BSA have done the next best thing. They've bought something out that resembles a BSA Gold Star, but it gives you a modern experience with a nod to the original. That's exactly what Triumph have done, and it's exactly what Royal Enfield has done, and it's unfair to expect BSA to do something different. I can't remember what day it was. It was week before last, the first week that I had this bike. We'd been out for the day on the bike. I didn't really want to go home, so I just took a detour to one of the local fishing villages just to stand and watch the river for a while. And an old chap came marching over. I mean, he must have been in his late 70s, and asked me if that's the new BSA Gold Star. Obviously, I confirmed that it was, and he started telling me about the Gold Star that he had back in the 1970s. Now, he made it clear that he really liked the look of the new Gold Star. I think he was talking to me for about 5 minutes before he realised it was water-cooled and had a radiator. And he clearly had, you know, fond memories of that old BSA Gold Star back in the 70s, but the stories that he told me about it seemed to involve rebuilding the engine almost on a monthly basis. And he was absolutely enthralled by the new Gold Star. I couldn't get rid of him. He gave it a very positive thumbs up and said that, you know, to his mind, it was a very faithful recreation of the original bike. He loved it and he seemed so excited about it. In fact, in the end, we had to leave him standing on the pavement as we got our gear on and went home. He even thought that the exhaust note was authentic. Personally, I wouldn't know. And the way he reacted to this bike sort of sealed it for me. What BSA have done is right. You know, the experience that we've had in these 2 weeks of just literally going anywhere and everywhere on this bike without any hassle, just thoroughly loving the experience. BSA have done exactly the right thing by not chasing what every other manufacturer is doing. I watched a few reviews last year by various publications here on YouTube that were invited to the launch of the bike, where the CEO of BSA said that this bike is not intended to compete with any other bike on the road, or words to that effect. And many of those reviewers refuted his statement, saying, no, this is definitely aimed at the Interceptor or the Bonneville or this or that bike, because the brains are just hardwired to follow the crowd. They're not actually capable of assessing a motorcycle on its own merits. They need to have something to compare it to. And if they don't have that data point to reflect back on, they just don't get it. They don't get that you can build a motorcycle that people want that is different from other motorcycles, that doesn't behave like other motorcycles, and that different behaviour might actually be what a lot of people want. It's a bold move, a brave move, which might actually backfire on them. I don't know, I hope it doesn't. It's a bike that anyone can ride, male or female. It's a bike that will do pretty much anything you want it to do. It'll be a great commuter, a great day out ride. It's going to be great for two-up, long-distance tours over, days or weeks. It's exactly what motorcycles used to be. And isn't that the whole point of a modern classic? Right, I'm going to leave you with it. I am, of course, going to be back next week, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.